Greetings. My name is Dr. Waddell Brooks, Sr., your host, and this is Community Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very fortunate to have with us two exemplary people here in Lake County, and it's going to be part two of the Senate Bill 2151, Crime Victims' Attorneys. We have with us, to my immediate left, Denise Rotheimer. She's the founder and executive director of Mothers on a Mission to Stop Violence. She's also an author of SB 2151, Amendment Crime Victims Compensation Act. And to her left is Lake County State's Attorney Michael G. Nearham. That's also going to be talking about the victims' rights attorney. Welcome, folks.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks.
Thank you.
We're very happy to, both of you took time from your busy schedule to be with us tonight. Last week we had State Senator Silverstein.
Ira Silverstein, yes.
Yeah, and he's the chairman, I guess, of the Crime Victims.
Well, he's the sponsor. He filed the bill. Yes,
right.
He sponsored it.
And he's very fortunate to have you, Denise, working with him.
Thank you.
So our listening audience enjoyed it, and we thought we would, it was so important that we thought we'd have part two, and this time we'll have the Lake County State's Attorney provide his input into the crime victims' attorneys. Denise, I would like, first of all, to have you give a little background of why, well, you're the author of the bill, so
yes.
We'll let you talk about the bill that you're authoring.
The genesis of Senate Bill 2151 really began after Illinois amended its state constitution. So the Illinois Constitution amended the Victim Bill of Rights, which prohibits the court from appointing attorneys for crime victims. Mm-hmm. However, the state statute does afford victims a right to retain legal representation at the victim's expense to represent them as though they're a named party. So Dr. Brooks, what that means is if you do not have the funds or the ability to retain legal representation, then you are not going to, a judge will not be able to appoint an attorney for you. So that creates a disparity among individuals in the community who are not able to afford at their expense to retain legal representation. And nobody should be denied or without access to legal representation, particularly those who go through a criminal legal system and have legal rights to protect and ensure are enforced. So that's why I wrote the language to amend the Crime Victim Compensation Act that affords up to $27,000 to reimburse out-of-pocket expenses that are related to the criminal offense. So victims already have this opportunity, but they need to be eligible. One of the eligibility requirements is that you have to report to law enforcement. So that means you are engaged in participating in the legal process. So that's a plus to the state. We want people to report so that we can address issues of crime and violence to prevent others from becoming victims. So what I want to do is just merely include legal representation as one of those expenses that are reimbursed.
Okay, we're going to ask Lake County State's Attorney Michael Nearham. I think everyone in Lake County knows him. But for those that may not know you, I'd like for you to just give a little snippet about your personal professional background, and then we'll talk about your role in this bill.
Dr. Brooks, I'm happy to be back on your show. I've been on a few times, and right. So if many people don't know who I am, and I'm the Lake County State's Attorney, as you know, and I was born here in Waukegan, born and raised, grew up in Waukegan, and went to law school in Chicago, and after that I started working in the State's Attorney's Office as an assistant State's Attorney, where I handled any number of types of cases, anything from traffic offenses up through and including murder cases. I left the office after a period of time there and went into private practice in Waukegan, where I served as a criminal defense attorney for a few years. I had a firm in Waukegan, did predominantly criminal defense work, but also some civil litigation, and actually worked as a public defender conflict position, where if somebody was appointed to the public defender and had a conflict, the courts would appoint me to represent that person. So I represented indigent defendants charged with very serious crimes. And then in 2012 I ran for this office and was lucky enough to be elected, and I sit now as the Lake County State's Attorney. And before we get too much further too, I'd like to introduce my guest. I have one of my favorite staff members with me today. I don't know if you can see him or not, but he's sitting at my feet. His name's Mitchell. He's a comfort dog, and we can talk about him later in the show, but I thought I'd bring him with me today so people could see him.
Okay, we'll let the camera highlight him because he's very important to you and the family, and also your office too, right?
He's part of our office. He is. We have a dog at home, but Mitchell is. He is part of our office staff. He was trained by a group in St. Louis called Support Dogs International, and they donated Mitchell after 2 years of training. He's a fully certified assistance dog, and he's part of our staff. He's part of our family, and he works predominantly at our Children's Advocacy Center, which is the facility located in Gurnee, where we handle every case in Lake County that has to do with the physical or sexual abuse of children. And unfortunately, there is quite a need. We had last year over 700 new cases come into that center. So if you can imagine coming in as a young victim, imagine you're 8 or 9 years old and you have to go in and be interviewed by a police officer about something horrible that happened to you, and the fear that comes along with that, and to go to this place and to talk to strangers. Is highly trained and caring as they are, they're still strangers. And we recognize that, and we know when these children come into our center, it's one of the worst days of their life, and they're terrified. So anything we can do to make that a little bit easier on them, we do. And I got the idea of employing a comfort dog a few years ago. We worked to obtain our own dog, and we're lucky enough to have Mitchell here. He's at the center every day, and he really helps the children if they want him. We don't, you don't have to use him, but if they want Mitchell, he's there to help them just feel a little bit better. And I met Mitchell when I was down in Springfield testifying in support of some legislation that Governor Rauner just signed, which will allow comfort dogs like Mitchell in appropriate circumstances to actually be in court when child victims testify. Because I just got done saying how intimidating coming in to be interviewed is. Imagine having to testify. Now you're in a big room, in a big scary room full of people, and the person that abused you is sitting right across the room from you. So it can be a very traumatic event, and the last thing we want to do is re-victimize these victims through the process. So because of this new law, these dogs will be able to be there at the feet of the child victim when they testify. And he's trained to do exactly what he's doing, which is to just sit here. He won't move. He'll kind of lay here. It seems like he's sleeping, but he's just there to be a calming presence, and he's been just a wonderful addition to our office.
Yeah,
So.
you gave a great synopsis of Mitchell here, but we have Denise Rotheimer is another person that you know and you're very familiar with. She's the founder and executive director of Moms on a Mission to Stop Violence, and she's also an author of Senate Bill 2151, which is an amendment, Crime Victims Compensation Act, which we're going to be talking about in addition to other parts of the crime victims attorneys. But tell us a little bit about how you met Denise and how she has influenced.
I met Denise, I think back when I was campaigning for office, because she's very active in really the community as a whole, but active as somebody that's an advocate for victims' rights. And certainly anybody that's running for state's attorney is going to cross paths with a victim rights advocate. And I think we certainly respect each other's passion for what we do. I know she's somebody that cares very deeply about victims and has worked very hard. We work together on a lot of issues, and we don't always agree with each other on stuff, but you cannot question her passion for what she does, and specifically with respect to this type of legislation, which we've talked about a lot. And in fact, this issue kind of goes back to when the victims' rights laws were first brought into play. And in talking with victims a lot, there's always been this frustration on the part of victims when they come into the criminal justice process. And let's not forget, they're coming into the criminal justice process because they're victims. They didn't do anything. They're there because somebody victimized them. So in the truest sense of the word, they're victims. So they're brought into the system where they don't know, a lot of times they've never been to a courthouse. They don't know what the terminology is that's being used. It's just an unfamiliar and, quite frankly, an uncomfortable environment. And you're sitting there as a victim. You've done nothing wrong. You're going to court. And the frustration that we hear a lot is that what they hear is all these rights, everything's about the defendant. And in their position, that's the person that harmed them. So you're going to court, you're listening to this, and everything you're hearing is about the person that harmed you. And I know that can be frustrating. Now, defendants have rights, and I believe in those rights, and we enforce those rights as well. But I can understand the frustration on the part of victims when they come into this system and everything's about the person that abused them and really nothing about them. So the Bill of Rights first started to give them some rights, but then the further frustration came when they found, okay, well, here now we have this whole list of rights, but they're really not enforceable. Because, for example, there was a right that said, I have a right to give a victim impact statement. Okay, well, if the victim came in and said, okay, Mr. Nierheim, I want to give a victim impact statement, and I said, well, that's great, but no. There was really nothing that victim could do to enforce that right, and that just further led to that type of frustration. Not that we do that, but any prosecutor across the state, certainly these rights apply to. So that what Denise is working to do is to allow victims a vehicle by which they can enforce those rights. And as we've talked about a lot, ideally, if we do our job, these people won't need an attorney. But certainly, if somebody has a right that is not being abided by, they have a right to have an attorney to enforce those rights, because a common misperception that a lot of people have with our criminal justice system is the defense attorney represents the defendant and the state's attorney represents the victim. And that's not the case. The role of the state's attorney and the prosecutor in our criminal justice system is really unique in all of law. We have, as you know, an adversarial legal system where if it's a civil case, you have an attorney on one side and an attorney on the other, and they both represent their respective clients. When I went to court as a defense attorney representing my client, I was there for my client and nobody else. As prosecutors, though, we have a much different role, and it's really unique in law. And what we teach all of our assistants is when you go to court, you don't represent the victim. You don't represent the defendant. You represent everybody. You represent justice. So, we don't strictly represent the victim, and in a way, we're there to look out for the defendant as well. So if we go to court, for example, and we see a defendant's rights aren't being abided by, it's our obligation to speak up even if their attorney doesn't. So we kind of have a dual role, but we don't strictly represent victims, and that's a misperception that I think a lot of people have. And that's why if there is a situation, and hopefully there wouldn't be, but if there is, where we're in conflict with a victim, they certainly have a right to have an attorney, and we would want them to have an attorney because, believe it or not, if there's ever any kind of conflict, it's much easier for us to deal with an attorney on the other side of that conflict. So I think what this legislation does is it allows for those victims that want to assert their rights, that can't afford an attorney, the ability to have one.
Denise, and tell us a little, you have been very passionate, about this bill. But what are some of the challenges and experiences that you've had in trying to get this bill passed?
Well, first, let me just applaud State's Attorney Nierheim for giving the extensive details that are very necessary to help people understand the State's Attorney's role. I was actually in Springfield this morning, working on getting some co-sponsors from all these senators, so I collected all these cards. There's 59 senators, and I probably got in touch with about maybe 52, 53. Well, there was one senator, I was able to catch her before she went into session, and one of the questions, I gave her the fact sheet, and one of the questions she asked me is, she goes, well, why would a victim need a lawyer? Isn't the state's attorney their lawyer? And that is a major obstacle that I face in trying to educate not just the public, but also the legislature on the role of the state's attorney. So I'm very glad that State's Attorney Nierheim explained that prosecutors are not victims' attorneys. And what that means in more detail is that there is no attorney-client privilege. Like if I were to hire an attorney, everything I say and communicate to that attorney is protected under client-attorney privilege. That it does not exist with the communication between a state's attorney and a victim. Also, victims may say things to attorneys, and again, I'm very involved with the research on this. There are some times when victims give information to state's attorneys that actually prohibits the state's attorney's office from even taking the case. So a victim actually causes him or herself harm by speaking without an attorney, but that's not really what this law does. But I just want to kind of give an idea of what it means to have legal representation. The major obstacle that I am finding with this particular bill, the first law that I authored, Jasmine's Law, I faced opposition from victim advocates, the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Violence. And I learned going into this area of work that this is an industry. Being a mother, my child having been raped, her name's Jasmine, that's for whom the law was named, I didn't know that there was an industry. And so they actually went to Springfield, testified in opposition. The bill ultimately passed unanimously because what Jasmine's Law did is it made alcohol an aggravating factor. Prior to Jasmine's Law, alcohol was excluded as an intoxicant. Now judges have discretion, it's not mandatory, it's at their discretion to double sentencing on all 5-class felony offenses if the minor victim under 18 was under the influence of alcohol at the time the offense of sexual violence was committed. So alcohol has the same effect as drugs. So if you were to induce a victim with a drug, a narcotic, or other intoxicant, alcohol has the same effect, but yet it was excluded. So we made that right. But I faced opposition from the victim advocates. The second bill to provide crime victims with information and an explanation, a sign-off sheet on their rights and compensation was also opposed by the same group. And also with the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So what I wanted to do is make sure that when you do report to law enforcement, that law enforcement provides you with information on your rights and to compensation, as I mentioned, the $27,000, because victims aren't getting this information and they sign off as evidence that they received it. However, because of their opposition, the bill got watered down. It removed an enforcement mechanism that I did have in place, which passed the House unanimously. But when it went to the Senate, the victim advocates sabotaged it there. So the sponsor in the Senate on that bill allowed it to be watered down and made it unenforceable. So I opposed it. It did get brought back, and I remained neutral, but it was the watered-down version. I am finding that even though victims are reporting, they're not getting information about their rights or compensation. And in fact, what that means to the public is there's funding available. As I mentioned, $27,000 for the crime victims. We had a total $5 million expire. They went unspent in September 2015. That's money that could have gone to, let's say, grandmothers who were raising their grandchildren whose sons were murdered. We know there's a ton of violence in Chicago. A lot of people could have benefited from the monthly benefit for raising that child. There's $7,500. I think it's like $1,250 a month in support if you do raise the child. Then you have $7,500 that could be reimbursed for funeral expenses. So we had $5 million expire when unspent. This year in 2016, $6.2 million will expire and go unspent. So that's a total of $11.2 million that could have been used for therapy, medical expenses, housing, child care, funeral, for victims of crime that are going unspent. This is unacceptable. I have zero tolerance for this injustice. The funding should be getting to them. So the opposition that I've been facing has been about the funding. There's been an argument that we should cap the funding for the legal representation. And my response to that is we can't cap legal representation because we don't know what right at what stage is going to be violated and how much it's going to cost that attorney to be able to effectively enforce that right for the victim. It's not the victim's fault that someone in the criminal justice arena violated a right or is preventing a right from being asserted. So why should the victim have to bear the expense? Because, see, these crime victim rights, they're procedures. They're basically a list of procedures that says what the state's attorney's office needs to do, what the law enforcement needs to do, prisoner review board, attorney general's office. And if they don't comply, then a right is simply not going to be enforced. So why should a victim have to take on the system when they're funded? They have all the resources. That's not fair. So why cap it? And the argument that I had was, and you have to realize, my daughter, I did put her through law school. I have great respect for attorneys. I don't bucket, professionals in the same group. I hold each person accountable for his or her own actions. But the opponents to this bill at the subject matter hearing that took place in September tried to make it seem like lawyers would ravish the funds. And I think that is completely discriminatory. I will not tolerate that kind of opposition. There has to be something meritorious, or you just don't even bring up the argument. Because to say that lawyers are going to ravish the fund, we have therapists who are able to get money paid for their services out of this fund. We have medical doctors, etc. Lawyers are in the same category of professionals as them, so we should not be discriminating. That's the only opposition I have to this bill.
Well, State's Attorney Nerham, it appears that this is not adversary between you and and Mrs. Rotheimer. You're both on the same page.
Oh yeah.
And so, but what challenge you see? Why in this bill, trying to get this bill passed?
Well, I think it is going to be the funding issue, which we live in a state where essentially that's always the issue, but that can't be a roadblock. I mean, this is, look, if the legislature is going to pass this law, and they're going to pass this law and give these victims these rights, well, then make it real, because a set of rights without anything backing them up, they're really worthless. But we are in complete agreement on these rights, and what they didn't really change anything in terms of the day-to-day operation of what we do in my office, because as I said earlier, if we do our job, this isn't an issue, because we're not talking about anything spectacular. We're talking about a victim's right, for example, to be advised of court dates, a victim's right to be protected. These are common, these aren't extraordinary things that we're asking for victims. These are things that we should be doing. Explain what the charge is. Explain a plea before a plea is given. Let a victim know what it means. If somebody's going to go to prison for a certain period of time, how long is that actually going to be? That's another misconception that a lot of victims have, and a lot of public has, quite frankly. There's a lot of talk right now about prison reform and reducing our prison rates, and I think there's some valid points to be made there. But what a lot of people don't understand is when you read in the paper that somebody went to the Department of Corrections for X amount of years, the actual physical time that person's really in prison is substantially lower than whatever number that is. A year in prison can relate to, it turns out to be just a few months actually. So if you're the victim and you hear, okay, this person victimized me and they're going to get 5 years in prison, and then a year later they're walking the streets, and you're wondering, how did that happen? Victims have a right to know that on the front end. So these rights, again, this is us doing our job. This is us explaining these things to them, which we should do anyway in an ideal world. Allowing them, as I said earlier, the right to give a victim impact statement at a sentencing. That's their right. And we shouldn't be able to stop them from doing that. So we are in agreement with that.
Well, I have a note here. Legal representation benefits crime victims and the state.
Absolutely.
Right? Benefits both. The problem, Denise, you mentioned about the money's available, but it's not released unless...
Well, the funding issue is not about putting money into the pot. That's not the issue when it comes to the funding. See, we already have this fund, so we're just using existing funds. That's why this bill, once it becomes law, it will provide legal representation at no cost to the crime victim and no additional cost to taxpayers because we're using the existing funds.
Okay.
In 2014, the fund was reduced by $2 million. It went from $8 million to $6 million. And the argument for why it needed to be reduced by the $2 million is because the representative from the Court of Claims said there's too much money in the fund. So they cut it down. We already have an amount that is there. It does get matched by the federal government by 60%. So Illinois, we have about 10 million total. I'm not saying we need to throw more tax dollars into the fund. What I'm saying is let's make whatever we have in funding available to cover these expenses. Now, the funding issue, when I was on the phone with the executive director at the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Violence, she was telling me, Polly Poskin, about their budget. See, the victim advocates, they have a budget. And I was explaining to her, my concern is not about your budget. My concern is only about the budget of the crime victim. I'm not funded. I don't take any funding. I do everything out of my pocket. So the funding that is available to victim advocate groups like the ICASA, Polly Poskins, who do get a salary for the work, is one issue that's kind of like in competition with the Crime Victim Compensation Fund. So the benefits that we would have for being able to get therapists, there's a mother that I assisted, and Dr. Brooks, I purposely didn't invite any crime victims to participate in the show. I wanted to keep it educational, upbeat, and positive so that I could get participation from the public to be able to call their senators and ask them to co-sponsor, and that's why I wanted like the state's attorney and the senator here. But I do want to make a point that I had a mother call me whose daughter was being picked up from the hospital, an attempt to suicide. She's 15 years old. And you know, with the senator, I've been involving him in the last 3-4 cases with Lake County State's Attorney Nurheim because we have a pledge. He signed a pledge with me that he would enforce the right. So anytime there's a crime victim who has a Lake County case, it's easier for me to get that resolved because he answers my call like instantly, meets with that victim, does exactly what he said that a state's attorney should do. He dots his I's, crosses his T's, and he makes sure those rights are enforced. But that's not the same relationship I have with other counties. So, you know, with this one particular mom, with her 15-year-old, I told the senator, you know, we have to make a priority here because when she comes back home, if she's not able to get that respect, and this is human decency, this is, you know, these rights that we're talking about, providing legal representation to enforce, it's the right to be treated with respect for your dignity, the right to information and everything that State's Attorney Nurheim has said. So when you are being further victimized by the system and you have nobody else to turn to, it leaves you hopeless. And so for like this 15-year-old, you know, because she couldn't handle, first of all, the sexual violence, and then on top of that, not being able to get an order of protection, not being able to get the prosecution, not being able to get any participation by the system whatsoever. And I deal with these calls all the time. I don't want to take on these calls anymore. I'm an advocate. I'm not an attorney. But if I can just simply put into law that victims can have legal representation, I can say to that mom, hey, you know what? I'm sure you got your crime victim compensation information because now I'm sure law enforcement are following the laws knowing that victims can easily retain legal representation because now there's some form of accountability. But if in case they don't, because not all violations or noncompliance of the law is willful or malicious, then I can simply say, here's the compensation application. Good news, you can retain a lawyer. You don't need to rely on me, and I don't have to try to call your senator to get your senator call that state's attorney or me call that state's attorney, and all of this work that has to get done. Meanwhile, they're without therapy, they're without assistance, and they're without services. And that is, it's unacceptable, Dr. Brooks.
State's Attorney Nurheim, you signed a pledge, but would you, and I guess the reason for the pledge, Denise, you made, I guess the reason for the pledge that I have him go through it. The reason for the pledge. You just want
Well,
to
the reason,
emphasize his support for
yeah,
the act and so forth.
because when we vote, Dr. Brooks, we consent. And I wanted to make sure that when I voted for the next state's attorney, it's because of my situation. As I mentioned, my daughter was raped when she was 11. We never went to the Child Advocacy Center, never knew anything about rights. I mean, it was just horrific. I wanted to make sure that I gave my vote to the best candidate. I didn't want to do this lesser of the two evils thing or nothing like that. I needed to make sure that whoever I gave my consent to was going to ensure that victims' rights were going to be enforced. So that's why I took it upon myself to hold a forum, write up this pledge, get involved with State's Attorney Nurheim's campaign, what he stood for, and based on what I saw, I endorsed him. So that's really where that is, and I just needed to make sure that in this county where I knew I could do something, I was going to be able to prevent other victims from becoming further victimized by putting that small measure of protection out there, and it has benefited quite a few people out there and made a real significant difference as far as the way that they now feel about the state's attorney's office, because not all violations or noncompliance are willful or malicious, but they do feel very dignified after being able to go through and get that explained to them.
Now, you see why now the pledge is not that they don't have confidence in you, that, which you mentioned, when you come up for election again, re-election, you're going to say, this is the pledge that you signed, but you probably would have that in your, going to emphasize that anyway, right?
Right. I mean, that was, I was happy to sign that pledge. I'm proud to sign the pledge, and it was really, quite frankly, easy for me to sign because everything that it lists are things, as I said earlier, that we should be doing anyway. And what that pledge did is you know, as Denise said, a lot of those rights, especially at that time, were really hollow because there was no enforcement mechanism whatsoever. There's a little bit more today, but back then, if, again, for example, if a victim wanted to give a victim impact statement in court and a prosecutor simply said no, and they walked up and said, well, what about my victim's Bill of Rights? So what? There's no enforcement mechanism. So what that pledge did, because even though there's really no way that that victim could then enforce that, I can enforce if my employees, my assistant state's attorneys aren't following those rights. I can surely enforce those that way. So that's where the pledge comes in. So if one of my assistant state's attorneys violates those rules, then we can certainly get involved. And there's been cases in the past where, you know, there certainly was no ill will or ill intent, but there are cases where victims weren't given information they needed, and I was contacted, and we were able to rectify those situations immediately. And another thing that we put into place after many discussions was a complaint form or a victim feedback form that's available on our website. So if you're going through the criminal justice system, we want feedback from you. We want feedback from anything to how were you treated when you called the office, all the way down to issues in terms of your victim's rights. And there's forms that people can fill out and send in, positive and negative. And we put a lot of care into trying to ensure that when people come into the system, that they're treated with respect and they're treated as comfortably as possible. Again, we have Mitchell. We have a group of women that volunteer in our office, and really their job is to be there to help victims when they come in. So if you're a victim of a domestic violence, for example, we know when you come to the courthouse, it can be scary, it can be intimidating, it's not a friendly environment. So just to have a friendly person to sit and have a cup of coffee with while you're waiting for court, we have that in our office. But there was a point brought up that I just want to highlight about one of my beliefs, and one of the reasons why I support this is, especially when you look at crimes against children and sexual crimes against children, the vast majority of those crimes. Now, I said earlier that we had 700 new cases in Lake County, and those are as awful case you can imagine. 700 of them. There's several cases a day coming into our center, new cases. But even with that number of cases, the vast majority of these crimes go unreported. The vast majority of these crimes are perpetrated by somebody that knows the victim. We spend a lot of emphasis on stranger danger, and we should, but the vast majority of children that are victimized sexually are victimized by somebody they know. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why a lot of these cases go unreported, because there's intimidation and there's fear and there's manipulation. But the other reason a lot of these cases go unreported is because victims and their families have a fear of the system. and you really can't blame them. And if you're the parent of a victim and you're deciding whether you're going to report this or not, and you're thinking, am I going to put my child through going through all this stuff? Or you're an adult and you've been victimized and you're thinking, is it worth it to call the police and report this because I'm going to have to go through all this, I'm going to have to go through the system? And there, in a lot of people's minds, is a very negative connotation there. So it's my hope that by doing things like this, by having these laws and enforcing these laws, having benefits like Mitchell, more and more people will see that it's not so bad. That when you make that report, that there are people on the other side of that phone call that are going to be there to help you and support you, that care about you. So it's our hope that this will encourage more people to report, so we can prosecute these offenders. Because, as I said, with the amount of cases we have, and there's a lot, there's many times more that go unreported.
And maybe after viewing this program, people will become more advocate, come forward, because they probably more cases are go unreported or
Right.
so forth because they, like you say, they're fearful. Now, this is one area where you may not be an advocate in a lot of things, but this is one where you're sincere in your heart. I mean, it's wrong, and you want to do something about it, man.
One of the hardest parts of our job as prosecutors is we see some of the worst every day. And in order to be an effective prosecutor, you have to have a heart, because if you stand in front of a jury as a robot and you just report to the jury what happened in a particular case, the jury senses that and they know that you're not really believable. So in order to portray the case effectively, you have to feel it, you have to believe it. And that comes with a price, that comes with a cost, because you hear a lot of suffering from fellow human beings on a daily basis, and any human being especially is going to be affected when children are victimized. So it's absolutely a passion, and it's absolutely as hard as it is to see what these little kids and even adults go through. It's the opposite of that is when you see the courage that they display when they come into the courtroom and they testify, or they come in and they be interviewed and they stand up to these offenders through the system. That motivates us, so it rewards us. So it does come with a cost, but the benefits completely outweigh any negative. And the positive, the additional positive to Mitchell has been because he is free roaming at the advocacy center. So as you can imagine, all the employees out there, the investigators, the counselors, the attorneys, everybody that works out there, they see this stuff every day. They talk to these kids every day and they feel it. So to have him out there literally walking the halls of the office helps them too, and they need it. They might not know they need it, but they need it. And we keep a very close eye on the people that are assigned out there, and we try to make sure that if they start to exhibit signs of burnout, that we get them out of there and have them do something else for a while, because it can definitely take a toll on you emotionally to handle those cases so often. But you have to let yourself feel it, or you're not going to be a true advocate.
We're very excited to have you on the program anytime, because it's very few times that people have a chance to see their Lake County State's Attorney and have him express, And this is not a campaign or anything. This is just the way you're free, what you believe in. You believe in going before the people and talk. So I want you to, again, reinforce your position on Senate Bill 2151.
I support it. I mean, I don't know how to be any more clear than that, but I support it.
Well, I'm going to send this whole video to all the legislators because to hear from the state's attorney give his position the way he has articulated leaves no room for opposition or no reasoning to not sign on as a co-sponsor.
And I've talked to our local legislators, and I do so on many issues, and we try to work together. And I think, we're lucky to a lot of extent here in Lake County because we have a group of legislators, and I believe this, regardless of what party they're from.
Right.
Because I really could care less. These legislators work very well together. When it comes to issues, whether it's issues like heroin or some of the other issues that we've talked about on this show, I have found personally that regardless of party, the legislators that we have in Lake County really are willing to set those issues aside and work together. I wish that could spread throughout the rest of the state, because I think we'd be in a lot better shape, but but here in Lake County, I've been very pleasantly surprised with the ability of everybody to get along and work together on issues that really matter, because these aren't political issues.
Right.
I mean, when somebody is a victim, it doesn't matter if they're a Democrat or a
Right.
Republican. It's just these are issues these are human issues, and as Denise said, it's about dignity and very, very basic things that people should be treated with dignity and respect when they come into a system that, as I said earlier, they've been brought into
Right.
through no fault of their own. So it's the very least we can do.
I mentioned at the top of the program is that I'm learning right along with my listening audience. So I'm happy to provide an audience for our listening audience to hear. But in addition to your true feeling about it, you have legal obligation to comply with the victim rights laws, right?
Right. And we do. And as I said earlier, it really doesn't change the way my office operates on a daily basis, because we do these things. There are things in there about, for example, providing a secure, safe place for victims to be in when they're waiting for court, for example. We have places in our office that are separate and apart and safe and comfortable for victims to be in when they're waiting for court. A lot of jurisdictions don't have that. You know, in a lot of counties, the victims sitting outside the courtroom may be right next to the defendant's family, and there's just really no separation there. So there's a lot of things that we do by way of our way of operating here that really fall within the guidelines, and we really, I think, go above and beyond. But these are guidelines. These are really a minimum. I mean, this should be a no-brainer for any prosecutor in any jurisdiction in the country.
Yeah,
So-
they're procedures, really. The rights, they're just really a list of procedures that criminal justice authorities need to follow. So if they follow these procedures, then victims get this right.
And that's kind of the issue, too, in terms of the need for an attorney. If we follow these procedures and in a sense, do our job, there's theoretically then no need for an attorney, because
Right.
there won't be any complaint, because their rights are being respected.
Because then the criminal justice authorities are following procedures. So this way, the only way to hold the system accountable is by affording legal representation, because when you do have lawyers representing victims, you can see where the violations of the law are occurring. And so if there's going to be this great number, which I doubt, I really honestly think the majority of prosecutors do their job diligently and work ethically with victims and make sure that they are in compliance. The few and far in between that do fall through the cracks, like myself and the others, the ones whose calls I've been getting, I think it's a very rare situation that it's willful and malicious. But when it is, there has to be a remedy. They can't just go unpunished or unaccountable. We have to be able to make sure that this individual, who's a human being, gets some type of resolve, because as State's Attorney Rotheimer explained, our children have been raped, our children have been murdered. We've gone through enough. You don't need to make it any harder, because we just simply can't bear anymore. So that's really what this does. And my prayer is that this will make all the offices compliant, and not a victim will have one need to spend $1 of their funding for legal representation. But if they do need to have that money available for legal representation, I say leave that money up to the discretion of the crime victim, because it is our right to build our esteem back up, which is empowering for victims, because that's what was taken at the time we were victimized. Let us decide what we need, what services we need to rebuild and recover from the crime for ourselves. Don't you, state, dictate to us what the cap on that's going to be, because we don't know, but make it available.
So you're satisfied with State's Attorney Nahum will enforce and comply with the pledge that he just signed, I guess, right?
Yeah, because when he's in compliance with the pledge, basically I get to call the victim back and say, you know, the state attorney himself is going to be calling you. The state attorney himself is going to be meeting you. So when I get the initial call or make the first initial contact, when that individual is just sobbing, crying, you know, my child has been raped, this is the situation, my son was murdered, whatever it may be, they're at their worst, because they have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. So it's kind of like they're broken. And when you can go back to that person and empower them, build their self-esteem, because that's the first thing I try to do at all times, give them hope. And then I called State's Attorney Nerheim, and then he says, okay, Denise, give me their number. I'm going to make that call. I'm going to call them right now. So I let them know, guess what? Things are going to work for the good. You're going to get this call, whatever information you need. If you didn't get to see that video the first time in court, he's going to make his staff available and his office, and you're going to be able to go there and spend all the time you need to watch every inch of that tape that you want, because he's going to accommodate you. So that changes somebody who's totally broken and in the worst situation to somebody who is dignified. And even though things don't always work out, you know, it's not about the win or the loss to us. It really isn't. It's about letting us participate. It's about treating us with dignity, letting us at least have some input, getting that self-esteem. We are part of this, not excluding us, whatever the outcome may be. So when they get that, they feel so much better. And now I'm talking to a happy person. Now I'm talking to somebody positive. I'm talking to a mother that I know is going to have a good day, and she's going to take her daughter to school and make sure she's got her lunch packed, and they've got goals, and they're going to be able to move forward rather than live with this depression, this, you know, the fear of the system and this betrayal of trust. I want people to work with the system, with our authorities, our elected officials, to make it the way we need it. That's what this legislative process is all about, going to Springfield, being a voice for us. And all the bills that I've authored, the Jasmine Law Victim Rights sign-off sheet, and even this one, has all been nonpartisan. It's never been skewed to a party. It's not a partisan issue. That's why they passed unanimously. So this is for the people. I need for the people to get involved. The people need to know that there really is a system out here willing and able to work, even with our legislators, as State's Attorney Nerheim mentioned. When it's a nonpartisan issue, you do get the support and you can move forward, but you have to get involved. You have to be a voice.
I've made this program available so that people can go online and they could watch this program in England, Australia, you know, Florida, New York, or whatever, because it's online, right? And we're going to make sure our videographer make sure it goes online within a few days.
Great.
It'll be online so people could watch it, and we'll be the example, you know, and about working with our state legislators and also our county officials, our state's attorney, and so forth, you know.
Because it's our government, right, Dr. Brooks?
Right. That's the key. We have to, and it's second to none.
Exactly.
Don't you believe that?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
We may get a lot of criticism, but it's second to none in the world.
It's the only system we have, so we have to make it work.
Yeah, yeah. It will work because we have the Constitution of the state of Illinois. By the way, I mentioned Constitution of the, but I have to mention this because this is February is African American History Month, right? And I have to mention this to support African American History Month. The first president of the United States of America just happened to be an African American. Well, to be specific, he was a Moor. And the Moors are dark skinned. They was called African Americans. John Hanson. And I mention this so that anybody that listens to the program can go online to John Hanson, Hanson. Now, he was the first president under who had the Articles of Confederation, right? Before the Constitution was ratified. But the Constitution was ratified. I'm getting away just a little bit.
That's fine.
Just let me get
Yes.
just a point here, since this is African American History Month. George Washington was the first president in 1787 when the Constitution was ratified. But he was about the 5th president of the United States. Before then, there was Articles of Confederation. John Hanson just happened to be black, to be the first one.
I did not know that.
John Hanson, ladies and gentlemen, Hanson, you know.
Very interesting.
And I'm sure State's Attorney Nerheim probably aware of this.
I was not.
Okay.
You know, I suppose I could pretend I was, but I wasn't.
Okay.
I was not.
But it just happened. People say, oh, President Barack Obama was the first one, you know. Well, we can go on and on that, but I just have to get that in. Thank you for allowing me away
It's
from
your show,
SB,
Dr. Brooks.
SB 252151. Well, tell us about this. You've contacted most of the state legislators. What's your gut feeling of what's going to pass or not?
I know the bill's going to pass unanimously. If I can just remove the opposition from the victim advocate groups and get the funding, matter out of the equation, because really there ought to be no conflict when it comes to providing crime victims with a critical service. That shouldn't even be raised, because really their mission, the reason why they're funded and in place, is to provide assistance and support for crime victims. So opposing us on this and making it difficult for us to even accomplish this really goes against their own mission. But in my communication with the senators, they do understand what I'm talking about. They do get it. It's, again, I think this education component that is missing, where they need to know that state's attorneys are not victims' attorneys. There's that misconception. So I'm going to send this video to them and ask them to watch it, or maybe even invite State's Attorney Nerheim to testify at the hearing, which might be even better, and just kind of restate, what he said today at the hearing.
Can I mention something else too, though? Legislators, they have mothers, they have sisters, and they have many probably more females in their family than males. This could happen to one of their families, right?
Oh, and it has.
Yeah.
We've had legislators who are victims of crime, whose children have been harmed and cousins murdered, or, there's been a lot of that, yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why you feel it's going to pass unanimously.
Well, no, I feel it's going to pass unanimously because it makes absolute sense. I mean, you're going to give victims rights, at least afford them legal representation, and now that the Constitution of the state of Illinois prohibits the court from appointing attorneys for crime victims, it's going to discriminate against poor people or low-income people who can't afford to retain legal representation. So we have to remedy that flaw, first of all, and make it even and allow for equal protection under the laws, because, as State's Attorney Nerheim mentioned, he was appointed by the court to represent indigent defendants.
Right.
So if they're afforded legal representation, and the major complaint that he mentioned is victims, are, why does the defendant have all the rights? Let us have some dignity in the process, because we are a component, not by choice, but we're here. Don't ignore us. Let us participate. And that's why it's going to pass.
Okay.
And that's a good point, too, because we have cases right now where victims have private attorneys representing them in their case. And that's not a new phenomena, but it's only people right now that can afford an attorney. So it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't only be for people that have means.
That's right.
A victim is a victim regardless of where they're from or how much money they have.
Because that's just another form of further victimizing the victim.
Yeah. And Denise mentioned, enlarged upon this too, funds are available, she say, in the, but
The Compensation Act?
yeah, they're not being used, so.
Oh, the ones that went expired.
Yeah.
Yes. They went expired. They expired because they went unspent. I did research. I contacted the Court of Claims, so Senator Ira Silverstein and I worked on that project to kind of show him in detail how it all works, all the components. And I learned through the data given to me, I did my report, a total of $5 million expired when unspent in September 2015, $6.2 million 2016. Terrible.
Appeals process, is that part of the bill too?
Well, see, the appeals process, now that's an interesting point, because when I had the victim advocates opposing me at the subject matter hearing, claiming that lawyers are going to ravish the funds, I mentioned that we already have in law, under the Compensation Act, legal representation. No cap, no restriction on how much money an attorney can charge to represent a victim on appeal of a denial of their application for compensation. So that's already been in place. But there was not one example any of those opponents could give to point out one lawyer who took advantage of the funding. Not one.
And the other issue is just by way of reality in terms of, because I had that same concern initially. Our attorney's going to come in and eat up all the money in this fund, so now there's no money left for counseling and all these other things. But knowing that there's a lot of money that goes unspent is I think something that's important for these legislators to understand. And also, as I started to say, talking basically in terms of reality, these aren't going to be complicated legal issues. These aren't going to be long, drawn-out hearings. These are going to be very simple issues. And the example could be this person wanted to assert their right and give a victim impact statement, and they weren't allowed to.
Right.
That's not going to entail a very long, drawn-out legal process.
Right.
So these are going to be pretty simple proceedings.
Very quickly, criteria, eligibility.
For the crime victim compensation, so
Right.
basically you, within 48 hours or 72 hours, need to report the crime. There are exceptions depending on the criminal offense, especially considering children, because they don't always report. So basically you need to just file that report with the police, and then you go to the Attorney General website where all the information on the application is there, but really that information should be given to you by law enforcement when you report. And then you just fill out the application, they submit it to the Court of Claims, you get notice on your approval, and then you can go see a therapist. The therapist can get paid out of the funding. You don't even have to be out of pocket. You don't have to be put on a waiting list, and you just move from there.
I'd like to say this, ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking with Denise Rotheimer.
Yes.
She's the founder and executive director, Mothers on a Mission to Stop Violence. Also author of Senate Bill 2151, Amendment Crime Victims Compensation Act.
Correct.
And another exemplary person, Michael G. Nearham, Lake County State's Attorney. And they both have been exemplary and been doing a great job. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks.
I couldn't think of two people in Lake County could do the job that you have done in promulgating information to our audience. Doing a fantastic job. And a special kudos to you, Denise, for being the sponsor of both of these programs. Senator Ira Silverstein last week, and State's Attorney Michael Nearham this week. And also Mitchell, been very, although he slept through the program, but I got a feeling he was listening and providing support like he does to the other victims here in Lake County. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Community Forum. My name is Dr. Waddell Brooks, Sr., your host.